So I'm basically going to tell you a bit about this study that we've carried out in Nepal, the scope of it, how we went about it, what some of our key findings have been, and what we think they mean for the wider international community. So first of all, the scope of the study. So we really set out, as Martin said, to explore the views and experiences of people affected by the Nepal earthquakes. And the question we were asking them was, to what extent were their information needs met, and how were they met? What sources of information did they rely upon? What were their more trusted sources, their preferred sources, and how did the information they got, how did it actually help? So from that, we were able to get some sense of the role of humanitarian responders in meeting their information needs. And by humanitarian responders, we mean both international agencies and also media development organisations. When you start looking at CwC, as we discovered very quickly, it's a huge area once you start talking about communication with affected communities. So we had limited time in the field, limited time to talk to people, so we really tried to bound this by looking at information. And we kind of defined information as what to do after aftershocks, about how to stay healthy, protecting your family. So we had quite a clear definition of what we meant by information, because somehow we needed to bound this otherwise vast topic. And so we did pick up some comments on and some feedback on the accountability side, but we particularly looked at the information side. It was very much intended to complement the existing knowledge in Nepal. So from the Common Feedback Project and the surveys that they had commissioned, we knew that people were dissatisfied with how their information needs had or had not been met. But there was a lack of understanding really about why the meeting of those needs had been so inadequate. So we very much set out to complement those existing studies. And as I say, we took very much a community-centric approach. So we didn't take a particular communication initiative, like how agencies used radio and then looked at that. But we started very much from community's experience. That was our starting point. So how did we go about it? Well, we adopted a qualitative approach to the fieldwork. We carried out fieldwork in 5 different locations, and I'm going to show you here a map of Nepal. Now, what you'll see is actually the areas that we were able to access were very much in the centre. They're very much around the epicenter of the earthquakes. But in fact, in an ideal world, we would have travelled further, but we were carrying out the fieldwork during the fuel crisis. So we had certain logistical constraints that we had to take into account. We mainly focused on Sindhupalchok district, one of the worst affected districts. We also consulted with communities in a camp in Kathmandu Valley and with a peri-urban community just outside Kathmandu. The consultation was mainly through focus group discussions, and we broke down the community into different groups to make sure we were hearing from men and women separately, from young people, from marginalised groups. And then we supplemented what we heard in focus group discussions with in-depth interviews with individuals, with key informant interviews, and we used participatory methods, which if any of you are interested, we can tell you more about that afterwards, so that we could really kind of get an overall picture and then kind of drill down with more in-depth questioning in the focus group discussions. And we focused on 2 time periods. So immediately after the earthquakes, how well were people's information needs met? And then 7 months later, when we were carrying out the field work, how did people feel their needs had been met on the information side? We did consult with staff of agencies and media development organisations, but obviously, as I said already, our main focus was on affected people. So, what did we hear? Sorry, that's a little bit small for those of you at the back, but anyway, let me tell you what we heard about people's information needs and the extent to which they were met. So perhaps not surprising, but very striking, was how information needs changed. So straight after the earthquake, people's information needs were very much related to immediate survival. They were related to the urgency of the situation, how to access rescue operations, sometimes what to do with dead bodies, how to survive aftershocks, temporary settlement, temporary shelter. Those are the kinds of things people were concerned about immediately afterwards. But 7 months later, there was a definite shift, and people were really looking for longer-term solutions. So they were looking to solutions if their houses had been destroyed, how they could rebuild. Was the land safe to rebuild? Was the land safe to cultivate? And especially, how could they access government assistance? There's some quotes here from some of the people that we met with. First of all, representing the period immediately after the earthquake. So the first quote was from a more accessible VDC, Village Development Community. They were saying that, to begin with, there wasn't any information. The first few days they weren't getting any information from outside, and that's when people mainly depended on calling family, relatives in Kathmandu to get information. But the second quote is actually from a more remote community, where they were saying, well, we did have radios and TVs, but most of those were destroyed in the earthquake, and these more remote communities were getting extremely little information, not just for days afterwards, but actually for weeks after the earthquakes. And then the last quote is from a focus group discussion with men in Sindhupalchok in one VDC, where they're basically saying what we need now is a sustainable solution to our problem. It's housing. We don't want to carry on living in tents. And that came through very strongly 7 months later. So a little bit more about the kinds of information that people wanted and how that matched with what agencies were providing. So in terms of emergency survival, there was a lot of information about how to survive aftershocks, for example. And people talked about how their knowledge about earthquakes really increased because of what they were hearing on the radio, because of what was circulating kind of within communities. But there were some unmet needs, and from women in particular, there was a lot of trauma and a lot of fear after the earthquakes, particularly as the aftershocks continued. And women expressed the need for more information to help them feel calm. And we think this also relates to the need for actually more psychosocial programming. It goes beyond just what information can provide. And of course, there have been a lot of rumours circulating, and there have been attempts to counter those rumours with projects like Internews' Open Mic project. But nevertheless, there was still a lot of people who struggled to get back to what the original sources of information were about. Should they expect another earthquake? How likely was it? And of course, people were looking for certainty about something that was very uncertain. We can't predict when the next earthquake will happen. In terms of behavioural change, I'm just going to pick out two particular examples of this. So, messaging about human trafficking. Now, that absolutely predates the earthquake by years, if not decades. Lots of agencies have been doing a lot of messaging with a protection objective around human trafficking, and many agencies stepped that up after the earthquake. So even though that wasn't information that was specifically requested from affected people, it did seem to be appropriate, as there is evidence that trafficking did increase, and women, of course, bore the brunt of the impact of the earthquakes in the agricultural sector, through lack of employment in the tourist sector, as just a couple of examples. Then health and sanitation messaging, again, a lot of that has got a long-term dimension to it. about defecation, washing hands, etc. And a lot of that continued after the earthquakes had happened. But affected people did feed back that they felt some of the messaging they were getting about how to purify your water, for example, they just felt was inappropriate. It was unsustainable, they couldn't afford water purifiers. So there was a sense of some kind of mismatch there in terms of what they were hearing and what they really needed. And again, women were kind of saying that, you know, it's how we look after our children, old people, pregnant women, especially in the immediate aftermath of the earthquakes. Information about agency programming, this is about relief distributions. Agencies often made that information available through VDC secretaries, local government representatives, and this was generally rated as some of the most helpful information that people got. It helped them to access relief. But they referred to getting that information more through those government representatives than radio, for example, even though radio had been used to broadcast when relief distributions would happen. The big gap was information about government assistance. So that's what people they kept hearing that there were grants, that there were loans, that assistance would be made available, but were really struggling to know how to access it, whether they were eligible. And this is where, again, there was a sense that some agencies tried to provide some of that information, but it was very problematic because there was a lot of contradictory information coming out from government. Even local government district officers were struggling to know what to say to communities because they weren't even getting clear messages from Kathmandu. So this final on this slide is a quote from a focus group discussion with young people. And this was actually a marginalised indigenous community in Sangachok, where they were saying, we just need to know, is government going to provide this assistance? Because we need to know how we get on with our rebuilding, with our kind of rebuilding of our lives as well as our houses. Let me say a little bit about people's preferred channels and sources of information. This was another area that we explored. And there was a very interesting distinction which came out between how people look to radio and TV for more general news and information, so general information about government loans that might be available, for instance, or about the overall impact of the earthquakes. But for information that was more personally relevant, and of course that's what they were really looking for, that was relevant to their circumstances. How do I access that assistance? Is my land safe? How do we look after old people when the house has been destroyed? That's where people were really looking for face-to-face communication and dialogue. That came through very strongly in our findings. It's not the first time that we hear this, but it's a really important message that I don't think we've yet taken on board. Because actually, if we looked at what humanitarian responders were doing in Nepal, there was a lot of focus on radio. Now, for some reasons it was obvious why. Nepal's got more than 400 community radio stations. It's easy and cheap to broadcast information, especially in a kind of highly mountainous, very challenging environment like Nepal. But there is a sense that there were people that wasn't reaching, and that wasn't really meeting, that wasn't really kind of people's preferred source of information, particularly that was immediately relevant to them. So NGOs did have frontline staff, often social mobilisers. They were often fulfilling multiple tasks. There was a bit of a sense of kind of overwhelm, that perhaps that face-to-face contact that people were looking for just wasn't available in the way that they were looking for it. I just want to say something briefly about the different needs and experiences of different groups, because this also came through very strongly in our fieldwork. So let me just touch on this quite quickly, but Men, for instance, were more interested in information related to settlement, their longer-term solutions for housing, entitlement to government, their entitlement to government support. And they also had access to a much wider range of information from government officials. They were the ones sitting in the tea shops where a lot of information was being exchanged. Have you heard this? So-and-so said that. They were the ones who listened to radio. Women, on the other hand, had slightly different information needs, often relating more to the health and welfare of family members. And particularly when we were doing the fieldwork in November and December, their concern was how to survive winter, which had already started. And as I already mentioned, there was clear psychosocial information needs. But their information sources were more limited. They were much more dependent on personal networks. So neighbours, family, maybe health workers, social workers. And this perhaps wasn't taken into account in the way that information was provided to the extent that it could have been. Younger people were interested in information related to education, when schools and colleges would be rebuilt, for instance. And they generally had access to a wider range of information sources, including the internet. Marginalised groups, and this includes both dialect communities and there was an indigenous fishing community that we visited. So they have very similar information needs, but interestingly they had much lower expectations about their information needs being met. And they also had weaker networks and social connections. So they were very dependent on perhaps their relationship with the neighbouring community, or whether the government representative for their area was well informed or not. So what have we learned from all of this that should inform how humanitarian responders do CwC work in the future? And I'm being a little bit selective here, so I do encourage you to read the report when it comes out, because there's a lot more in it, but we've only got a limited amount of time. First and foremost, the message came through very clearly that people are looking to government for a lot of their information needs. So humanitarian agencies were able to meet the needs immediately after the earthquake, about relief that was available, about how to stay safe, how to survive the aftershocks. But really people were looking to government for the kind of longer term solutions. So this has got implications for how humanitarian responders work with government. And we felt there was a need for them to work more closely with government, recognising all the challenges of doing that in the Nepal context, particularly at the national level. But there is learning from elsewhere, from Haiti, government liaison officers, working more closely with government district officers, for instance. Secondly, as Martin's already said, there's a real message here about putting the human back into humanitarian. So really responding to people's need and demand for more face-to-face communication. People who are experiencing a lot of trauma, that's the information channels that they normally use. And how can we work much more effectively with those information channels? Now, people actually came up with their own suggestions about how to do this better. So, using government representatives, making sure that agencies in a particular area have got the telephone numbers of the VDC secretaries and ward coordinators and are using them to pass information on. Identifying trusted sources at community level, so health workers, social workers, teachers, and using them as focal points and as channels for information. Exploring how community-based sectoral committees could also play an information dissemination role, and making more use of younger people. That came back from younger people themselves. You know, we've got access to many more information sources. They would be the ones that would move to the next village if they couldn't get a good mobile phone signal in their village. So how can we involve them more in CwC activities? But there's also a message for agencies here about how can we incentivize agencies and staff to spend more time listening and responding to affected people. The increasingly sophisticated information technology is very seductive, but it's not always going to meet the needs of people on the ground. And there are some interesting models that we think could be built upon, coming out of Nepal, the Mobile Citizens Help Desk, the Internews Open Mic project, which I'm sure Stijn will say more about, but they were operating on quite a small scale. So we didn't actually meet anybody in our fieldwork who had had direct contact with those projects, but nevertheless they were projects that were really reaching people in a face-to-face way. And then ensuring more detailed needs assessments so that what agencies are doing are really meeting what people want. Lastly, recognising that different population groups have variable access to information and also different information needs. So taking account of the barriers to information flows that may affect women, the elderly, marginalised groups, particularly linguistic barriers in a country like Nepal. There's a real need to monitor and understand better the impact of CwC activities. So there's a sense that there's quite a lot of innovation going on, but the kind of monitoring of what's working and what's not working is kind of lagging behind. And there were quite a lot of quantitative surveys done in Nepal, which were great in terms of providing some hard data, but a real need to complement those with qualitative studies to find out the nuance, the why behind the figures, and to really make sure that we're doing these studies as rigorously as possible, because there's a lot to learn. Strengthening partnership and coordination. So the Common Feedback Project, the CwC working group, played important coordination roles in the Nepal response. But despite many of the positive things they were doing, there was a sense that agencies were all putting out their own messages. There was very little coordination in terms of coming up with common messaging. And so that was one area where we felt there was a need for stronger coordination. And also stronger partnerships between humanitarian agencies and media development agencies. There's organisational cultural issues which make it challenging, but to really make sure that we're benefiting from the potential of both. And finally, guidance for aid practitioners on CwC. So we think this study, plus the work that was done in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, provide some really valuable material that could be fed into guidance material for how CwC can be done really effectively, particularly after earthquakes. So typology of approaches, of information, channels, what kind of channels are appropriate for what kinds of information, and really encouraging agencies to be very, very clear about what are the purpose and the aims of the information that they're making available. So that, believe it or not, is only a small part of what we've found out. But anyway, I hope that at least gives some headline findings, and I'll pass on to the others, but we can, if there's particular things you're interested in, we can try and come back to them in the session.
What is the adaptive challenge that this report is asking us to identify and answer? You know, is there any one thing that you want to point to? But that's a bigger question I think our community needs to take on board. And then secondly, perhaps related, the report points to a big misunderstanding about information out, I think, in terms of communication with communities. And any messaging with communities, to communities, should always be predicated on contextual needs and based on formative research with communities, as we just heard from Theo, which suggests, I think, a systematic underinvestment in listening. So, larger questions again, what are the barriers to listening that we face as a community? And I think perhaps particularly for Stijn and Theo, what's the role of local media in this context? What role can local media play in addressing this challenge? Because I think that the humanitarian community and traditional aid providers don't necessarily understand and work with local media in the way that they should be doing so. Thank you.
I think from the first question, what is the challenge for listening? I think it's absolutely true. You have on the top people who look towards their accountability, which is upwards, the donor, and like how to make sure that whatever they got the money for, that they also will deliver on. But that is actually decided before, like they go in very often. We would like to get money for 50,000 tents. Here is the 50,000 tents, we have delivered them. And actually there's not much in between. There's a lot of pressure, time pressure, etc. to deliver that they want to take into account. And then you have the local humanitarians, volunteers, very often also local NGOs, etc., who are executing those projects. They have contact with the affected population, but they don't have the power to change anything. They will have to get that truck to the other side of the hill. They will have to get like another truck delivered with whatever is inside. And so that's I think a bit of a disconnect. So why would I listen if I'm a humanitarian under time pressure to do something that was decided before I even got hired very often as a local? Because that only frustrates both parties. So that's in the bigger picture. I think that's where a challenge is. As for the local media question, I think still too often local media is being considered as the megaphone for messages, and not enough used and worked with as the facilitator of a conversation, as the one who have the best local knowledge. And I immediately also, I think that's where the biggest sort of shift in thinking has to come. They're facilitators, they're mediators, right? If they're doing their job right, they know very well how the local community works and how you can work best in the local context. So I think that's a bit of a shift of thinking. I have to say there's challenges with that as well, because media and local media don't necessarily see themselves that way. Like very often a local radio station with the local radio host, he's the dude in town, he's like the most popular guy, like he loves to talk behind his microphone. He doesn't necessarily listen very well, you know, like, I mean, but you can work with them, and that's what we try to do with Internews. Like, hey, like, you can actually get a better relationship with your audience if you start listening as well, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So using them as a mediator, facilitator, rather than a megaphone, I think that's where the real sort of, yeah, beautiful work happens.
I've read the report and commented on it already internally, so my question is more broad for the panel. I was wondering what practical recommendations you have for humanitarian agencies who are primarily mandated to respond to need, be it assessed or assumed, as it was right after the earthquake happened last May, to better meeting preferences, which aren't the same thing, are often outside an agency's mandate and sometimes completely unattainable.
Hi, I'm Katie from the Communications for Development Network. So I have a question about development. Theo, you were saying capacity building before is really, really important in preparedness. But what duty is there for capacity development while the resources and the focus are flowing into a specific area? What's the duty and how much is really realistic?
Yeah, so we only partner with stations that meet the BTC standard. I'm joking. So with the question on capacity building, I think your question was, is there a duty? I think that's the question. So, yeah, I mean, I think there is, and I think there's a difference between capacity building and training. And training is much easier to do at mass scale, and capacity building is harder. So I can only speak for us, but we are doing training at mass scale, and we're doing capacity building at a smaller scale, and that's been our approach. I think a combination of the two, I think, is what's needed. You know, capacity building in the preparedness phase, and then during the actual crisis, yeah, of course, you can't only select partners that reach a certain standard. But I do think there's a strong argument to do work in the preparedness stage where you can, as well as during the crisis.
We've got a few comments to make, thanking all the presenters for all of this information. I haven't read your report yet, but I certainly look forward to seeing that. The reflection I have is really to tie, I think, the opening question and the last question. The opening question, what is the adaptive challenge for the system? And WFP at the end stating what their concerns were in respect to the constraints that they face. I think that rather sums it up for me. I do think there's a significant cultural shift we all have to engage with. And that is not to set aside the skills, the knowledge, the culture that already exists, but it's to blend that commitment to mandates and technical expertise which exists within many agencies with a much more open culture, which allows for change and encourages much more accountability, and not just to do it. I emphasise that. So I think we're all engaged with that challenge, and I don't think it's easy. But I think there are some constraints which are self-imposed, and I think we need to address that and face that honestly and shut them out and get on with it and accelerate, I think, really. You said it at the beginning, we've been talking about a lot of these challenges for a number of years. It's not all bad. It's not all bad. I think there's some excellent practice out there. I think there's some excellent practice in terms of the protection field, for example, in terms of true accountability and face-to-face accountability with beneficiaries. I think we need to bring the human across all the spectrum of our responses, not just in those cases. So those are my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have nothing more to add except one small point, which is just on the point of interest about the Federation of Red Cross in the Ebola outbreak is actually doing research because they discovered that their field workers were adapting messages and using it in a way that they found that their local people. So that's they're very cautious about it because obviously for all the reasons that Steve said, I mean, it is about a control system, but it's also about a letting go system, which I think would be probably very interesting if could be somehow that kind of thinking could be used elsewhere to localise a lot of things and lose some of that power structure and create more equality and give people who are actually having that interface the credit for that kind of action. Anyway.